All right, good afternoon. Today we're talking about ethics and a little bit about communicating in special situations, mostly about ethics. But I wanted to start by showing you a short video, and then I'm going to go through some questions that we would usually talk about in class. So with that said, we are going to watch Kyle Fields blow up. Now, I think probably none of you would have been here for this at this point. This is 2014, so unless you've been in school for quite a while or grew up here, you would not have seen this. But this is what it looked like.
3, 2, 1, we have ignition.
Okay, just wanted to show you two different views there. So the reason I show you that is because of how many engineers had to have been involved in that, and also how many people needed to be informed, how many different entities needed to be involved, because there's a lot if you're going to blow up a football stadium in College Station or anywhere else. There's a lot that needs to be done. Also, I don't know if you guys saw those two birds flying away at the end. Kind of feel bad for any of them. Probably wasn't the best day, but they got away. So some things to think about here. I have a list here that we would normally go through. Agencies involved in the demolition. There's a lot. So not only do we have the cities of Bryan and College Station, which even though it's in College Station, both would likely be involved because Twin Cities, a lot of people going back and forth in terms of who needs to know about this. You need to involve both cities. TxDOT would of course be involved because Wellborn is a TxDOT road. The university naturally would also be involved. There's a lot of collaboration that needs to happen here. And that's not even talking about the public yet, although those agencies do communicate with the public. We take that one step further to public safety, and we've got police and fire that we have to communicate with. How do we let people know? So are we going to post on Twitter, put out an announcement on the radio? How do we get to college kids? How do we get to people who are not in college? Because not everybody who lives here is in college. So we can't just communicate through the university listserv. We need to figure out how we reach out to everybody else in the community too, because everybody needs to know what's happening and when it's happening. They need to know what's happening so that nobody's alarmed when they hear the big boom. Also, so that they can avoid the area. We don't want anybody driving down Wellborn. Wellborn was closed for that, and it's a pretty major road. So we need to notify people so they know to avoid the area. We also want to plan around as much traffic as we can. So what that looked like here, and some of you, if you were paying close attention, might have seen the date on the video. It was in December. So they scheduled this for after finals were over. Anybody who didn't need to be here was gone. Anybody who didn't want to be here was gone. So unnecessary students have left. It was also early on either Saturday or Sunday morning. I forget which one. I think it was a Saturday morning, like 7 a.m., about 4 days before Christmas. So in terms of avoiding people who maybe weren't coming out just to see that, that's probably the best time they could do it. However, Kyle Fields is pretty iconic. So safety precautions also had to be taken for people who did want to watch this, because a lot of people did want to watch it. So that involved setting up viewing areas, a safe distance away free parking for anyone who wanted to watch. You didn't need to have a parking permit to go watch. So schedule it when nobody's there, hopefully, but plan for people being there. That's kind of what the university and the town, all the involved agencies did here. Stakeholder opposition. There will be stakeholder opposition in probably most projects, but certainly any project that involves an iconic piece of infrastructure like Kyle Field. So Kyle Field is very important to Texas A&M. People get sentimental. There were people who didn't want Kyle Fields to be torn down, even though we were tearing it down so we could build a bigger and better Kyle Field. People still didn't like that. So how do you deal with that? There's also people who will say, you know, don't do this construction in my backyard. You've probably heard the not in my backyard thing. So we have to deal with all of that. We have to deal with people who live here and maybe are a little bit irked by all the construction that happens at the university, and also people who are really diehard Aggies and say, well, if you're going to take down Kyle Field, I want some of that grass, which is actually what happened. So some of those rich Aggies, they got pieces of Kyle Field. They got pieces of the grass, pieces of the stands. This is common for really important buildings, stadiums, stuff like that. It was done with Yankee Stadium in New York. On a more sober note, it was also done with the 9/11 attacks, not for people to have so much, but for museums to have. You'll notice that a lot of that rubble is in museums around the world. If maybe you've seen it, maybe you haven't, but if you haven't, it wouldn't be too hard for you to find. If you wanted to go see a piece of the Twin Towers, same thing happened with the Berlin Wall. Some of you have probably seen pieces of that and not been to Berlin. I'm actually in the category where I've seen pieces of it in Berlin and not in Berlin, but I'm probably in the minority. If you haven't seen a piece of the Berlin Wall, the Bush Library and Museum has a piece or two of it. I don't think it's open right now because of COVID, but if you are in town, or will be in town in the fall, I'm sure it's opening maybe this summer or soon. I think things are starting to open back up, so you can go and see that. So people want to keep pieces of history. You have to, maybe not as the engineer, you deal with all of these people personally, but all of these people are involved in your project, whether you like it or not. So you might have to deal with them. You might need to have answers for some of this. I'm not going to play this next one, but I'll explain it for a minute. It's blowing up a bridge that's over a river. So that adds in a few more complications in that you are demoing something over water, which is inherently more risky to the environment. So there's more precautions that need to be taken, but it's not local. So I think the local stuff has a little bit more meaning. That's why I showed you Kyle Field. So hopefully you've all seen this. It's a selection from the Engineering Code of Ethics. If you haven't, then you should probably glance through it. We have the link right on here, asce.org/inside/code of ethics. So this first one is the most important. That's why it's bold and in red. It's the most important. Engineers shall hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. That is your whole mission in building infrastructure, to make the public safer, healthier, good welfare for everybody. If you mess up, it has really drastic consequences for our safety, health, and welfare. And we're going to go through some of that. I know some of you have already gone through the Hyatt Regency practice that is posted on the discussion forum, or maybe it's the quiz. I don't remember. It's on one of those. So some of you have already watched that video and read through that case study. That was an example of a catastrophic failure in civil engineering that resulted in loss of life. This is not usually intentional, of course. That's a whole different ethical issue if it is. But accidentally missing something and it resulting in loss of life is also an ethical issue. So really important to always keep in mind that, you know, it might not be in the same way as like being a firefighter that people's lives are in your hands, but they are. It's just further down the line and maybe you don't see it as much. But if, you know, if the infrastructure fails and people get hurt, it is really important that we try not to make that happen. Okay, so public statements, issue public statements only in an objective and truthful manner. Why is this in our ethics discussion? We don't want to embellish anything or exaggerate. If you're telling the public that, oh yeah, we've got this under control and maybe it's not quite under control yet, you're just exaggerating a little bit, it's still unethical. This third one on here, sixth one overall. Act in such a manner as to uphold and enhance the honor, integrity, and dignity of the engineering profession. This one's the obvious ethical issue. This one is usually purposeful and, in my opinion, a lot worse than just the accidental missing something, even if it doesn't usually result in loss of life. Because it doesn't usually result in loss of life. Fraud, bribery, corruption is purely to benefit you or your company. And that's very unethical. So don't do that. You need to continue professional development throughout your careers, which some people might not think of as much as ethics. But if you aren't up to date on the most current technologies, you're going to lag behind on how efficient and effective you are as an engineer. So it's really important to keep up with lifelong learning. We're going to have a whole week of that later on. So you'll hear it again. And I think we're also going to have a guest speaker for that. I don't have that confirmed yet, but we usually do. And I think he's going to talk to us again this summer. So we'll speak more about that later, but it is really important to ethics. And we're going to talk about normative ethics more in a minute. We're going to talk about the different ethical situations or categories. So your responsibility, you turn data into useful information. That's not my job, that's your job. I'm not an engineer, so I can't take the math and science and build a bridge with it. I don't know how to do that. That's your job. And I rely on you for that. I don't think every time I drive over an overpass, I really hope the engineer was good on this overpass so it doesn't collapse. I don't think that. I trust you. And the rest of the public does too. So you are responsible in that sense for keeping us safe. I know it's a little heavy. It's a lot of responsibility, but that's why they pay you so much. Is because you do have a lot of responsibility. You're also responsible for improving our quality of life. And we're going to talk about this more later in the semester as well. But the presence or absence of infrastructure is directly responsible for our quality of life. Right now, I'm in a house with central air, electricity, a refrigerator, all sorts of cool stuff. I would be a lot less comfortable if I didn't have any of that. It's like 100 degrees outside and couldn't really do Zoom school without my laptop and an internet connection. So even though it's maybe not a safety issue for me if I didn't have power, although as we all know, back in February it was, but right now it's not. It's a quality of life thing. I can also get in my car, which works. I have a working car, drive on roads that are well maintained, and go to HEB, get myself a snack. So I have a higher quality of life than somebody who lives in a house without air conditioning, doesn't have an internet connection, maybe has roads, but they're in really bad condition, doesn't have access to a grocery store. So I know that engineers don't always make the decisions about what gets built where, but because often city governments, state governments do that, but you are responsible for carrying that project through to the end. So in that way, our quality of life does fall on you. And believe it or not, many engineering failures and construction claims, maybe you've heard this before, occur because of inaccurate communication. So probably most of your classes haven't been focused on communication yet, but this one does. And this is one of the reasons why. Most of these don't end up in the news. They really don't, because most of these don't result in a newsworthy loss of life, which would be any loss of life, or a newsworthy setback, which would be a bigger financial setback. So usually any construction claim or failure, it just results in a delayed project timeline and a little bit more money, but it's not going to end up in the news. Now, if somebody dies, it's absolutely going to end up in the news. And this isn't just something that happens a long time ago. It's happened within the past couple of years in this country, and I think even more recently in some other countries. The most recent one I can think of off the top of my head in this country was an overpass that was built in Florida. And I don't think it was open to the public yet to go over the overpass, but it was open to drive underneath it, and it collapsed on top of cars and killed people. That was within the last 5 years, I think. So these failures, they have real consequences. Even though very often it's not a major consequence like that, it's a more minor one, it's still a consequence. These are 2 examples of engineering failures that occurred as a result of communication, very obviously as a result of communication. So sometimes it's a little bit harder to tell whose fault things are. And with these as well, it's a lot of people's fault. It's always more than one person's fault. But these 2 in particular are very obviously a result of communication issues. So the Mars Climate Orbiter disaster was in 1998, which now that I'm thinking of it, some of you might have been born in 1998, so you probably don't remember that. But 2 engineering teams were working on this project and used different units. Why we as in the United States still use different units from the rest of the world is beyond me, but we do. And so what we saw here was one group was using US units and one group was using metric. And somehow, throughout all the calculations and all the work that went into this, nobody caught it for months, maybe even longer. Nobody figured it out. And nobody ever did figure it out until it disintegrated in the upper atmosphere. Nobody died here. This was just an insanely expensive mistake, and a really kind of stupid one too. Hyatt Regency, of course, you guys have that case study. The drawings submitted by the structural engineer were preliminary. The steel fabricator interpreted them as final and just went forward with it. So in this one, watch the video for a clearer description of what went wrong, because I think that video does a pretty good job of explaining it. But they had these suspended walkways, one on top of another. They collapsed and 114 people died and 216 were injured. This is also a really expensive mistake, but more importantly, it's a tragic mistake. So anything where people die is in a different category than the Mars Climate Orbiter disaster, which cost millions, but nobody died. So it's a little bit different. Messing up on communication can have consequences like this. We hope it never does, but it can. So just important to mention those things. Okay, so kind of piggybacking off of that, your ethics right now really only affect you for most of you, unless you're talking about ethics at some internship you have or a campus job. But as a student, it's really not going to affect anyone else but you. So right now, you can maybe cheat on a test or steal someone's homework, beef up that resume a little bit by exaggerating or just putting more stuff on there that you don't actually have experience in, plagiarizing. that's simple examples of ethics as a student. And you can get in a lot of trouble for any one of these things. You can get kicked out of school, and then you wouldn't be allowed to be an engineer anymore because you wouldn't have a degree. But really, it doesn't affect me. So if you steal another student's homework and get kicked out of school, that doesn't affect my safety or my well-being. It affects you. As a professional, everything you do affects others in terms of ethics. So if you log more time on a project than you actually worked, that might not seem like it really hurts anybody. But when you log more time than you actually worked, you're getting paid more than you should be getting paid, and you're not getting as much done as you're saying you're getting done. So you're costing time and money for that project. That affects whoever's paying for the project, as well as the other people on the project who now have to make up for that work that you didn't actually do. So it affects others. Claiming expertise you do not possess is really dangerous, I think. But if you do this, either you might do it wrong, in which case you're costing time and money, and potentially safety, or maybe you do it right, but it's still not ethical because somebody else should have been doing that. That's somebody else's area of expertise. Hiding errors discovered in plans and specifications is probably the most egregious of these, I think you could do. And this can be, even if you think it's a really minor error, if you don't tell somebody about it, it can result in one of these. Because this Hyatt Regency disaster in particular seemed like a minor thing. It seemed like a minor change. So nobody looked into it. They knew it was there, but they didn't actually check with all the calculations to make sure that it would hold the load. So it seemed like a minor thing. Nobody checked it, and we had a catastrophic failure. So, and that was just, that wasn't like purposely hiding the error. It's even worse, I think, if you hide the error that you found, maybe because you don't want to admit that you made a mistake, or you don't want to admit that your colleague or your friend made a mistake. It's not worth it. And ignoring unfair treatment of a colleague, that might not affect you at all. The rest of these will probably affect you in some way, but that one might not affect you. It will affect your colleague. If your colleague is being harassed or in any way treated unfairly, and you don't speak up about it, I mean, you might not face any sort of disciplinary action, but ethically it's wrong if you ignore that. Okay, so I kind of mentioned this, but all of this stuff is important because you build big stuff like this. I took this on Google Images, so I don't actually know exactly where it is, but it's a, big bridge. You guys build big stuff, and civil engineers build big things. And if it goes wrong, time and possibly lives. So really important. Quick overview of the general studies of ethics, general areas, of ethical study. We won't go significantly into this in this class because it's not an ethics class, but we do have an ethics week, so we're talking about it a little bit. Metaethics is the study of where we get right and wrong. So what makes us good? What makes us evil? Can we be good or evil without religion? Do we need that to define what we see as good? This is going to be different for every single one of you. Some of you might be very religious and think that you can't get your ethics without religion. And some of you might not be religious at all and say, I get my ethics from my parents or whoever raised me. It's going to be different. And that's kind of part of the tough thing about ethics in engineering, is because so much of it does come from you, from how you're raised, and from your definition of right and wrong. We try to get away from the subjectiveness of that by having the ASCE Code of Ethics. That's kind of why we have that, but it's still a little bit subjective. So normative ethics, the study of what people should do. This has heavy religious ties. So What kind of person should I be? How do I know if I'm a good person? What is right from wrong? Not where do we get it from, but what is it? And so we see this in a lot of the religious codes. So 10 Commandments, 5 Pillars of Islam, whatever religion you might be, there's probably some sort of list or definition of what you should and shouldn't do. I'm fairly certain every religion has it. All the major ones have it. I know that. And then applied ethics is how we apply that, how we figure out what's right or wrong in a given situation. So this is the area of ethics that you will be using. You'll be mostly applying your normative ethics along with the ASCE ethics to figure out what to do in a given situation. So what is my responsibility when I see a design error? ASCE might cover that. And ASCE also might cover what to do if you see a colleague being mistreated. But if that's not in your list of ethics, then your normative ethics might kick in there and say, I should say something if I see something that I think is unsafe, even if it's not illegal. So we have ethics, morality, and the law. That's what we're talking about on this slide. So ethics is a system for applying morality. Morality is your personal beliefs on right and wrong. And the law is the US government's definition of normative ethics in this country. As you know, that will vary from country to country. And some of you are in different countries this summer. So you would be living in a different legal system, which has a different set of rules based on that society's normative ethics. And that purpose is to encourage certain behaviors, punish others. All of this is heavily influenced by individual values. Even the law, the people who made the law, it's influenced by their individual values. Some of you might have seen this in the reading. Sorry, I almost said the book. I realized that probably none of you bought the book, which is good. You don't need to, because I took all the readings from it for you. But this graphic, in some sense, is in there. So it's really helpful, I think, to divide this into four quadrants. Hopefully you're almost always in this first one up here, legal and ethical in the workplace. So at least 90% of your activities should fall into that, maybe like 98%. If anything falls into another category, I'd say this one's the best one to be in. Oh wait, no, is that the right one? Yeah, if you're exposing dangerous information. You either want to be the legal and ethical one or the one pointing out that other people are being illegal or unethical. You don't want to be in either of these bottom ones. So exaggerating your qualifications outside of your area, that might not be illegal. It depends. Some of this does depend on the specific situation. It might not be illegal. It definitely is unethical. There's really no wiggle room on the intentional fraud, negligence, or breach of contracts. That's both illegal and unethical. I don't want any of you to ever be in this category down here. And if you are, you might end up on that show, American Greed. I don't know if any of you watch that. It's pretty interesting. It's all about illegal and unethical people, but it's real stories. So I think it's pretty interesting. Okay. So normally in class, what we would do now is we would put these up on the screen and have you guys decide which of these are illegal, immoral, or unethical. Since it's just me here, I'll be going through them for you. So anyone cheating on anybody else, not illegal in this country. It is in some countries, but it is not illegal here. So that might be unethical. It might be immoral. It is not illegal. An older supervisor asking a younger employee out on a date. I think this probably depends on the specific rules for that company. If it's one time that the supervisor asks the younger employee out on a date and the younger employee says no, then maybe it's okay. But you're still in that potentially unethical category, because since it's a supervisor and a younger employee, the younger employee could perceive it as, maybe there's something to gain from this relationship. So you're in some gray area right there, but it's probably not illegal. And it might not be immoral or unethical, depending on the situation and those two people, but it could be perceived as immoral or unethical. Probably unethical, probably not immoral. But like I said, depends on the situation. You help yourself to office supplies from work because you are not paid very much, depending on it could be illegal, depending on what those office supplies are. If you take a printer, that's probably illegal. If you take a couple of Post-its and pens, it's unethical, but it's probably not illegal. So I would say here it depends on what the office supplies are. And it was interesting to see this play out at the beginning of the pandemic with everyone now working from home. Oh, can I take this computer home? Oh no, we have to get you a different computer for home and put a barcode on that computer. What you could and couldn't take home to work from home, I think was interesting to see. You and your boss use the company credit card to get drunk after landing a big new client. Now, this one, it's probably a little bit immoral to get drunk. It's probably okay to have a drink in celebration, but probably not to use that to get drunk. In terms of whether or not it's illegal, I think it probably depends on company policy. Some companies have very strict policy, some don't. Oops. You use the company credit card to buy wings and beer for clients at a local Hooters. Now you are buying, so if we take the Hooters out of this category, out of this sentence, I see nothing wrong with it. If you're buying beer and wings for clients at Buffalo Wild Wings, I don't think anybody would question it. Since you're at a Hooters, it's probably, it can be perceived as unethical or immoral. Definitely. It's probably not illegal, but it's probably in that area that you shouldn't quite venture into. And lastly, this one's just for fun. You rob a liquor store with a flamethrower and a monkey named Harold. You take only pint bottles of Fireball whiskey and every tiny umbrella they have. Now, since you're robbing the liquor store, it's definitely illegal. Whether it's immoral or unethical that you are only taking the Fireball whiskey and every tiny umbrella, I don't know. Maybe Harold likes those. Okay, so how does this figure into your actual requirements for your job? You maybe know this, maybe you don't. State of Texas, if you're getting licensed here, requires 15 professional development hours per year, and at least one has to be in ethics. You can study ethics any way you want to count for this one PDH. So you could read a book on ethics, take courses offered by the city, take professional courses that are maybe offered by A&M or, not by the city. Formal education, college education. You can go to lunch and learn. A lot of workplaces have lunch and learns. Probably one of the easiest ways to get a PDH in ethics. And mentoring. Find a mentor. Yeah, find a mentor. This is kind of independently of ethics, but it's really good to find a mentor. So do that ×3. Okay, talk about the future real quick, just for a little bit of perspective, and then that's it, we're done. Hopefully this video wasn't too long or boring for all of you, but here we go. Strap in. Material science, computing, medical engineering, all will have fundamental ground level effects on our views of what is possible and thus what is good and not good. We have different views today of what is good and not good than we did 50 years ago. And part of that is because of developments in science and engineering. We won't get into all of that right now, but most modern ethical issues have something to do with science or engineering. So just a few ethical questions to think about. we might use AI at some point in the not so far future to design buildings. Let's say that and maybe even to approve buildings. Maybe we'll still use people for that. But if we use AI to design a building and that leads to structural failure, who's responsible? Is the AI responsible? Is the company who wrote the AI responsible? Are you responsible because you signed the plans without thoroughly checking them? Maybe both. I don't really know. Do robots have intellectual property rights, or can robots be sexually assaulted? Really interesting question to get into. This first one I actually thought of from watching some old Star Trek episodes. Star Trek has a lot of like, if you watch some of the older stuff, they do a pretty good job of predicting where we are today in terms of technology. And in the Star Trek Voyager series, they have this AI. It's called the Doctor, because he was the Doctor, but then he was a lot of other things too, who I think writes a book or something like that, or an autobiography about his experience. And there's this whole question of, well, is it somebody else's book because they wrote his code, or does he have his own code? And so is it therefore his book and he should get the intellectual property rights? And so this was kind of being talked about in the early 90s already. If all of a sudden we program robots so that they can adapt on their own and have feelings, then theoretically they could also be sexually assaulted and have opinions about intellectual property. If AI computer systems have rights and your car is run by one, mine's not because my car is kind of old, but some of those newer cars do have computer systems in them. Does your car have rights? Will we ever run out of work for people? If we do, is that good or bad? There's some stuff in the news right now about, there's high unemployment rate, or higher than there was, and companies are needing to pay more to get people to work there. And the bigger fast food places like McDonald's, Taco Bell, or whatever, they actually have the ability to go fully automated and just have robots do everything. And so that's an interesting ethical question. Okay, yes, people should be getting paid more than $7, $8 an hour. But at the same time, if we're going to make people get paid more than $7 or $8 an hour, what if those companies then say, well, it's more cost effective for me to just get a robot and pay 0 people to work? Then what do we do with all those people? We'll talk about the future a little bit more later in this semester as well. And we can maybe discuss some of this in our Friday discussion. Hopefully you all got that email. And after you die, will your mind be uploaded to the cloud? Science says we're not too far away from this. And if you do you still exist? Do you still need a will? Is it really you? All sorts of crazy questions. I know that's like a little bit of a tangent to go off on in terms of ethics, but it's some interesting things to think about. This is the discussion for the week. I know some of you have already done this. So if you haven't done this, then please go do it in the next few days. Read up on the Hyatt case. I've given you everything you need to in the discussion. So this YouTube link is there. And there's also a pretty brief description of what happened. It's like a couple paragraphs long. And I just want you to think about and talk to each other about who's at fault and who could have fixed the problem. And you'll see on there, but in case you haven't seen yet, everyone has to post. This is your participation. So you have to make a post of some sort. But I don't just want everybody repeating what the previous person said. I know that happens a lot in online classes, and that's not what we're trying to do. So if your only post is in reply to somebody else, that's okay. Also, feel free to post more than once. I know probably none of you will, but you can. So that's your one activity for this week. And then you also have a quiz, sort of like last week, but it's only one question because we wanted you to get some writing feedback before Memo 1, which is due next week and is a more major writing assignment. So just a few sentences for that quiz. I said, don't write us a paper, and I meant don't write us a paper because that's not the level of detail we're asking for. We're asking for a paragraph. So with that said, I think that's all for the ethics discussion we have here. And hopefully that was a little bit interesting and not too long. And hopefully I'll see most of you on Friday. Bye.